So who are the stakeholders involved in this? Obviously, we have got the domain subject matter expert, very, very important, because they know if you're talking about insurance, actuarial sciences, they're the best people. If you're talking financial services, you've got the banking and financial service experts coming in and lending their expertise, their experience to the product and to the features. And same way, if you're developing a hospital management system, the healthcare specialist, the life sciences specialist would be the right people because they are aware of those. So you need to be wary of what is the kind of expertise that is required and bring them onto the board. And the same with, for example, the solution or the implementation subject matter experts. These are the people who have got, again, a lot of input and insight into the solution, how that should be structured. So the domain subject matter expert and the implementation SME, they both work in tandem to be able to arrive at identify the as is versus the to be, and the journey that you need to take from here to get to that point. And in the process, what are the workarounds, what are the breakdown scenarios, what are the problems, what are challenges, where the pain areas, you can really kind of get a better understanding working with both of these types of SMEs. And also that would mean that we would need to work with the operational support, the infrastructure teams, the networking management team, the HR and the support, all of those support professionals and supporting teams to help us in managing these requirements in a better way. So perhaps that means that we need to have some tools in place, some of the networks, some of the technologies or applications and softwares need to be installed and configured so that that would help us. I think we've had a look at those in the previous session, talking about Rational Requisite Pro and then iRise and the Azures and the stuff like the Xure RP. So all of these and also the prototyping tools and then the configuration management tools, Rational suite of tools, all of these would help us to manage the requirements and to help us maintain the requirements in a much better and effective and efficient manner. And obviously the regulators, because they are the people who would actually provide us the rules, the changes in the laws, the regulations, the all the calculations that we have, whether it is taxes, whether it's insurance related stuff, whether it's healthcare, HL7, HIPAA, and all these kind of regulations that we have. How should we go about doing what we're trying to do? That is actually guided and perhaps even to some extent directed by the regulatory bodies and organizations. So we need to be wary of these kind of regulations and make sure that we abide, because they're compliance. It's not a matter of whether you want to implement that or not. Sometimes it's a question of by when you must have that in place, right? So all of these need to be in place, and then obviously the testers would be coming in handy to make sure that your entire life cycle of the requirements, all the way from the requirements architecture, the code blocks, design, high-level design, low-level design elements, and then obviously the test cases, everything is actually kind of neatly tied in. And then they're the people who would make sure that the requirements that you have originally captured are validated, verified, and the build is actually kind of accommodating those requirements, not something else. So the verification, validation of the build of your product is actually done by the testers and the QA. So very important to have them here. And what kind of techniques we use? We have, obviously, we discussed as the business rules analysis. We need to deploy quite a lot of these business rules, rules engine and rules. There are different types of rules workbench, rules engines that are available in the market. Either we can have that, or simple case of maintaining the Office of productivity suites like Microsoft Office or these kind of tools would help us to have a better handle and a grip on the business rules definition, their implementation, and subsequent changes. And the same with the functional decomposition. We had a discussion on this the last time around. We need to have the top-down approach and the structure of how the whole organization of the content is, how the whole organization of the structure of the product is. So for example, it could be the top-level core that could have multiple modules, and each module again could be broken down into further sub modules or functionality, and then functionality again could be broken down into epics into stories into tasks, subtasks, so on and so forth. So that sense of decomposition, not just, what I'm talking about is more in terms of the product structure and the requirement structure, but also the functionality could again be broken down further in terms of an analyzed further, from the functionality point of view. And the data flow diagrams are very important here because they would represent the linkages or the relationships amongst the different entities we discussed. For example, the customer having multiple accounts, each account having multiple set of transactions, and each transaction resulting in, for example, the end balance or whatever it is of the particular account. So all of these entities and the abstract and also the what we call as there's an abstract entity, and then there is a composite or a concrete entity in terms of a particular physical aspect of that entity. So for each of these, how do they tie together? So you've got a person that is me, and I can have an account with a particular bank. So account basically is not me, it is representing me. So that is an abstract entity, whereas me being a person having a sort of physical characteristics like name and the demographics and the experience and the qualifications and my age and everything else would constitute what we call as a concrete definition of me being an entity, right? So, and then you create that abstract entity called account, and then account will have transactions again, which are basically abstract. They're not really physical stuff that is happening. You can't really pick one once something can't feel that transaction. It's not tangible that way. So all of these need to be defined well, and that's what we actually try and represent in the data flow, data models, data flows, and that would help where the data is coming in, where the data is going into, what kind of information is exchanged, what kind of reports are being generated, where is it stored, how is it retrieved. All of this information is again, part of the DFDs, the data flow diagrams. And use cases and scenarios also help you to get to understand the interactions between the system that you're developing and the different actors and users. So essentially, it's all about, it's not technical, but it's more in terms of the functional interactions. For example, a user inserts the card into the ATM machine. So that inserting of the card, and then once he or she inserts the card into the machine, then the exchange of information that takes place, the machine challenges with a dialogue to ask them to enter their PIN code. Then they enter the PIN code. Once they enter the PIN code and press the button, that gets that actually gets checked against the database. And then once that is validated, the system then presents with some options for them to see where they can withdraw the amount, they can actually enter the amount, they can change the PIN, and then they opt for one of those, for example, withdraw the amount. Then it asks them how much amount, then they're entering. So this constant dialogue, right? The system between the system and the user, right? This kind of dialogue, this conversation that is happening in terms of the asking some information, giving it, then giving more information, then entering. All of this is basically what we call the interactions between the system, which is basically the machine in this case, or the software that is housed in the machine, and the user. So this is what we capture in the use cases and scenarios. So basically, there are different use cases. They capture the flow of information, flow of interaction. So sometimes the flow could be like a happy path scenario. So for example, the first time around when it presents you the dialogue to enter the PIN, you give the PIN right, the correct PIN. So that's a happy path scenario, and you enter the amount, everything is happening fine. All of these is basically a happy path, as what we call happy day, happy path scenario. And then there could be some kind of alternate scenarios where it is not usual, but it's not unusual either. It's not impossible either. For example, you might have inserted a card the wrong way, or you might have entered you might have inserted a incorrect card, or the card is invalid. It's expired, right? All of these could be the cases. And then you might have entered the wrong PIN code, right? And then you have entered the wrong amount, which is more than the balance that is there in your account. So all of these are possible scenarios. We are human, we could potentially do things incorrectly. It could be out of our, either we do not know that we're doing something wrong, or because of the fact that we have things out of our control, we perform some things, or just out of our own frustration, sometimes things might happen. So in which case, these are the scenarios that need to be still addressed by this machine or software that we're developing. So in which case, we call them as alternative scenarios or error scenarios, or subflows or alternative flows, whatever you call it as. but we need to capture them, and we need to start think about those scenarios that are potentially bound to happen. Not usual, not the everyday scenario, but still we need to address them because it can happen with you, with me, with anybody. So those are the ones that we can again capture: the worst case scenario, the best case scenario, and the average scenario. Similarly, the happy path scenario, the alternative flows and the alternative scenarios, error scenarios, exception scenarios, all these subflows, alternative flows, whatever we call it as. And then the process modeling, we discussed this technique last time in terms of identifying the the workflows, the workarounds, the breakdowns. User stories, again, a very important requirement capturing mechanism. It's very popular. We've had a discussion around this in the agile courses, in the agile Scrum course, for example. We discussed this at length in terms of what a user story is and how that should be structured. The 3 C's: the card, conversation, confirmation aspect of a user story, how that should be really written very, very, very subtle, very simple, and the way it is written is easily manageable. As a user type, I like to do this activity or functionality so that I get this benefit. Simple construct there. And then once it is there, then obviously we need to add more detailing to that. We can attach estimates to that story, user story points. And then we can also attach the prioritization, the Moscow prioritization. We can put these stories into a sprint or a product backlog, all of these that we discussed. And then the aspect of how to define good stories, right? We discussed that INVEST principle: independent, negotiable, valuable, estimatable, sizable, and then obviously the final one is the testable, INVEST principle, to define what a good story should be. And data modeling, again, we've just discussed that in the context of data flow, that we need to have a conceptual understanding of what are the different entities, how they're related to each other, and then how we as BAs need to come up with the kind of relationship diagram we call as ER diagram, but nowadays it's called logical data model or conceptual data model, which is basically what we were doing about 20 years ago in the context of ER, entity relationship model, ER models. So now it is called data model, but essentially it's the same thing. And document analysis is basically the reference of the documents, of related manuals, references, going through the documents, or even we ourselves being users trying to write the documents, trying to document and look at what we have been doing in terms of the sampling and the activity reports and activity cards being written by the end users. So all of these are basically the sources for the secondary research sources for the document analysis for the team as well. So very important that we maintain those as well. So that's all part of the maintenance of the requirements.